New Zealand, when I was there, was divided into two missions. They had the Auckland, New Zealand mission and the Wellington mission. Now it's divided into three. There's a Hamilton mission, and I don't know a lot about that because I wasn't there when that happened. But the church has been there for a long time. The Hamilton Temple was built, I believe, it was the 11th. It was either the 7th or the 11th temple built in the world. I can never remember. It's the same design as Switzerland, and it's the other, whichever one. Well, Hamilton isn't, is the one that Switzerland is. And it was built entirely by volunteer labor, by the members of the church. They provided the funding, they provided a lot of the resources and the labor to get it done. And so it was built very similarly to, the Salt Lake Temple and all the other earlier temples. It wasn't done by professionals typically. The church at one point was a lot larger than it is now. There was a time where several of the Maori chieftains met together and they had a prophecy because missionaries, not of our church, but other churches, started to come over preaching Christianity. And they met, and one of them told them that they would know when the true church had arrived because the missionaries would come wearing white shirts and they would go 2 by 2. And when missionaries originally came, most of the Maori population in New Zealand joined the church very quickly as a result of that meeting. And since then, people have kind of lost touch with a lot of the Maori culture and don't know about those types of events. And so a lot of, let's just say there's a lot of less active members of the church or descendants of less active members or descendant of members. Most people there, though, know about the church as a result of that. Because there was a really strong influence for a while of the church over there. That's how they got a temple so early. And so the mission populations, though, are quite different. The Auckland mission has about 3 million people living inside of it, and the Wellington mission has about 1 million and a half tops, because of the way the populations are spread out. Auckland is the biggest city in New Zealand and has about 3/4 of the population of the country living in and around that area. And so most of the areas that we served in were pretty small. There was about 112 to 126 missionaries, depending on how many my mission president could get or not get. He wanted to cut us down to about 100 missionaries was his ideal. He never got there, but we stayed between 112 to 126 typically. And aside from two cities in particular, there's on the South Island, there's a city called Christchurch, which had 3 or 4 sets of missionaries in it, and in the Wellington area, which has a whole zone around there, so probably 6 to 8 sets of missionaries or more, maybe as many as 12. I can't remember at the time. Most of the areas were pretty far apart. So I served, my first area was in Christchurch around all these other missionaries, and then I went to the very southernmost city in New Zealand and was in a branch of about 40 people on a good day, and was 45 minutes drive away from the closest set of missionaries, who were an hour and a half drive away from the next closest set of missionaries. And that wasn't typically, terribly uncommon. There was certain sets of missionaries who were as far as 2.5 hours away driving, which isn't as big as in the other missions, but for us it was kind of a big deal. It was pretty far away. The smallest branch I ever served in had about 7 people that attended it, including us as missionaries. On an average day, we might get as many as 12. You might have probably as little as 5, but typically no less than that. And my biggest, we had 125 people attending. I think the biggest wards that were in the mission had about 200, 250, but I never served in one of those. We had, I think, 6 or 7 zones, depending on how long in my mission you look at, because there were certain times where we dissolved zones and combined them with other ones, other times where they recreated them, just because of the number of missionaries that would fluctuate. But we did a lot of door knocking, a lot of finding, because there just weren't a lot of members in a lot of places to help us. They just weren't used to having missionaries there a lot of times, or they weren't used to having to help. We had to train them in that quite a bit. And I served in a lot of the smaller, more outlying areas in my mission. And so spent a lot of time trying to find people to teach.
The New Zealand Hamilton mission, it was actually a mission previously a long time ago, and they did away with it when they were consolidating a few of the missions. But recently they brought it out with the age lowering in the mission field, and it's a really, really amazing place. The people in New Zealand are some of the closest people to the Spirit that I've ever met. In the dedicatory prayer of the New Zealand Hamilton Temple, President Kimball, he tells the people that they are the descendants of Hagoth, who was a person in the Book of Mormon who left in the later chapters of Alma, and they went into the islands of the sea, and they were never seen of again. And so those people, they were very, very righteous. And still to this day, many of their cultures resemble those cultures that were shown in the Book of Mormon. And so when you teach the people the truth, when you read them the stories of their ancestors, they're very, very close to the Spirit. And so many times they know that it's true. And it's really, really amazing to see when they remember who they are and their heritage, and it fulfills the prophecies that are proclaimed in the Book of Mormon. It was really, really cool. I think there's about 12 stakes in New Zealand, and the church is really strong there. There was a time when the people in New Zealand were looking for a church to go to, many of the Maori people. And they had the Catholics coming over from England and a bunch of other churches that were trying to convert people to come to him. And so a Maori king, he said, I'm going to figure out which church is right for the Maori people. And so he went and he prayed. He fasted and prayed for 3 days. And when he came out at the end of those 3 days, he told the people, he said, the true church is for the Maori people is not here yet. But when they come, they will come 2 by 2. They will come from the east, and when they pray, they'll raise their right arm to the square. And so the people at that time, they didn't have the church. But shortly thereafter, 2 missionaries showed up to one of their villages, and they offered to pray. And they noticed immediately that these people were the fulfillment of the prophecy that was proclaimed so long ago. And right then and there, a whole entire village was baptized. And from there, the Maori people just continued to flourish in the gospel. And so many, many wards have a lot of Maori people who have been in the church for a long time. And some of the early missionaries like Matthew Cowley have some amazing stories about how people just flocked to the church in the early days in New Zealand. Whereas today, now there's so many descendants, and the church is really strong there. The population is about 4 million, and there's about 40 to 50,000 members in New Zealand. The Hamilton mission covers from Auckland down over to Gisborne and then over to Taranaki. So that's in the northern island of New Zealand. We taught people from everywhere. There were people from European descent from South Africa. There are people from Cambodia that we taught. There are people from China that we taught, from basically all the different islands of the sea. And so it was really, really amazing to see how everyone from different cultures, they all came, but they all were seeking for that same thing, and that's to find a purpose in their life and to find out how to be happy. And it was a great opportunity to be able to share the gospel with them and share what makes, or that their Father in heaven has a plan for them. And it's really cool to see when a family who isn't a part of the church see the gospel and how it changes their life and apply it.
So New Zealand's divided into 3 missions. You got Auckland, which basically just covers Auckland City, the biggest city in New Zealand. You've got the Hamilton mission, which covers kind of the northern half of the North Island of New Zealand. And Hamilton has where the temple is, so that's a huge member base right there. And then you have the Wellington mission, which is the biggest geographically. It's got the entire lower half of the North Island and all of the South Island. And because of that, it's the most rural, it's really the most spread out, and that's also the mission where the church is the smallest, or you could say weakest. Also, in just modern times, the Australian economy is a lot stronger, and so the mission where we were in had a lot of people leaving and going to Australia for work, and some of the units and wards or branches have suffered a lot because of that, because just so many members have been moving to where the mining jobs are, right? But the church's history in New Zealand is actually quite strong. It's the Maori language, which is the language of the indigenous Pacific Islanders. It was one of the first languages, really. I want to say it was the 5th, but I might be making that up. One of the earliest languages, though, that the Book of Mormon was translated into. And there's really a strong, in the Wellington mission specifically, in the lower North Island part, a really strong member base in a lot of these really small rural towns, like the first one that I went to, because way back in the day, there was this young missionary named Matthew Cowley, and he was pretty much the greatest thing since sliced bread for New Zealand, and went around, he got there, didn't speak a word of the Maori language that all the missionaries had to learn at the time, and so he just, there's lots of legends about him. The common one that I was always told is he couldn't speak. He went up on a mountain for 2 weeks by himself. Nobody knew what he was doing. Nobody heard a word from him in all that time. And then he came down 2 weeks later speaking fluent Maori, not only fluent, but better than any of the tribal chiefs or anyone could speak, because he had learned it, he had gifted tongues. It was supernatural. It was a miracle, right? But in any case, Matthew Cowley had the best Maori out of anybody, went around baptizing in whole villages and things, and it was just super famous, well known. New Zealand government people would have him translate important documents into Maori just because his Maori was better than anybody's, even the native Maoris. And so a lot of that influence still lives in parts of the Wellington Mission today. A lot of areas where I served in particular were places that had a lot of influence from him, and people still remember him. The generation that actually knew him personally is right in the final stages of dying out right now, sadly. But the legacy kind of goes on. And because of that, New Zealand, and especially among the Maoris, the church has always been very strong and very solid since the beginning. So Wellington Mission has no temple. If you're in the Wellington Mission, you will never go to the temple. Don't get your hopes up. It's not going to happen. Stakes, districts-wise, I think there's 10 stakes and districts combined in the mission. If memory serves, probably 6 of those are stakes and 4 of those are districts. Maybe it's 7 and 3. And a lot of the stakes and districts and wards and branches are kind of undersized, a lot because of this emigration to Australia. So a number of the wards I served in, like my first ward had, I think, an average of 30 people attending on Sunday. So not really ward size, but again, it was bigger not that long ago before the economy changed. I think New Zealand is easiest to look at the people if you divide them into really the 2 main groups that we have, which are, one would be the Pakeha. That's the Maori word for white person. They tell me that literally it translates to white pig, but that's the word you'll find for what otherwise they'll call English or European people, like myself. And the Pakeha, they tend to be, the older generation especially is Christian. They're generally Anglican, Church of England, or Catholic, but although there's many other Protestant churches as well in the mix. But the Pakeha in general are becoming more and more secular and less interested in religion. The majority of my investigators were Maori instead of Pakeha, right? They weren't the white New Zealanders, but they were the indigenous New Zealanders. Both because of the areas where I served that had a higher Maori population, but also just because they were more willing to listen to us. They're the poorer class of people. They're a minority group, and they were much more ready to listen to what we say. Not just, I think, because of that socioeconomic factor, but also just because I think this is a good place to kind of say about how spiritual the Maori just are by themselves. If I had $1 for every time a Maori person had told me that they had a vision or a dream or an angel or a revelation or this or a miracle or a healing or something, I wouldn't be super wealthy, but I'd be able to take myself out to a couple of nice meals. There was a lot of spiritual phenomena that happened in my mission, and most of that centered around the Maori people rather than the Pakeha. People quite understand that when people come to the door, you're either the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of times we were mistaken for the Jehovah's Witnesses, but that's when we would just say, oh, we're from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and kind of emphasize that whole take. But apart from that, the general viewpoint that New Zealanders have of the Mormons is probably similar to what you'd find in America or Europe, is that they tend to come to your door, they might annoy you a little bit, they're generally good people, nothing too out of the ordinary in that regard. So I served from July 2013 to July 2015. My first area was Dannevirke. It's a little rural country farm town, lots of sheep, lots of unemployment. My second area was Johnsonville, which is just a suburb of Wellington, the biggest city, and that was kind of more happening from busy just people standpoint, but we didn't actually teach as much there, oddly enough. My third area was a suburb of Hastings. It's called Havelock North. That's Hastings has two suburbs. It has a wealthy suburb and it has a poor suburb. The poor suburb has an entire stake all by itself. It's tremendously successful for missionaries. But Havelock North, where I was, is the wealthy suburb, and we had very little work going for us there. But we had a lovely beach in the area, and it was really great. I loved that area. I wasn't there for long, though, because then I got moved to my fourth area, which was my favorite overall. It was my only area on the South Island. It's called Greymouth. And it was it's the rainiest part of New Zealand, the west coast. And it's also fairly cold. It doesn't snow there like it does in the far south of New Zealand, but I did get pretty cold there. But during the summer months when I was there, it was just super beautiful. Incredible coastal drives that we had to take to get to district meeting and back every week. It was just really great. So I loved that area. And then my fifth area I was again in kind of a suburb of Wellington. It was Lower Hutt, and that was a good area too. I really enjoyed that. So I spent about half my mission in and around Wellington City in kind of, an urban environment, and then the other half really pretty rural in the middle of nowhere, lots of sheep, lots of unemployment. And so the difference between the two was really big. The missionary work I always found was a lot better, actually, the more rural you got, because generally people were more humble. They were also generally more Maori, which is also a factor. Because, the cities tend to be more diverse, more multicultural. So in the cities, you'll get, not only the main three groups, right? White, Maori, Pacific Islander, but you'll also get Indians, Asians, and things in and around Wellington and maybe Christchurch even. But not so much if you go to like the middle of nowhere, Dannevirke or Palmerston North. You get a lot of Fijians in Palmerston North actually, but that's a topic for another day. And so the city, I always found the life is a lot more fast-paced. It's maybe more fun just because if you're in the country, you're going to be the only missionaries for like hundreds of miles probably. And you don't always get to like do things with other missionaries on P-days and stuff. Whereas if you're in the city, you're going to be around other elders. You're going to be able to have a game of touch rugby on P-day or some basketball or a card game if you all got really bored and it was raining. And the cities also just have bigger wards, so you'll probably get fed better in the city. But then on the other hand, the country, the people are more humble, generally more teachable. And so it's probably, you'll do more teaching in the country, in my experience at least, and maybe have more to do in that sense. But at the same time, the country is like pretty slow because there's just fewer people around. And so when you weren't teaching in the country, I felt like it was hard to find things to do, hard to keep yourself occupied. And you don't usually get fed as much, which is a serious downside.